Like most series that have seen many releases over the years, there are a number of good and not so good Batman games out there. Many developers have tried their hand at making them, and not even the old Sega Lord X here has played them all. Despite that, I have played a great many of them, and in this episode, we will go over what I think are both the best and the worst Batman games out there. I specifically avoided games where Batman was not the central character, and I avoided games where Batman was not directly playable. I wanted these choices to be dedicated titles with a heavy focus on what the IP was known for. There are 15 games on this list, and they are coming at you in no particular order. Hope you guys enjoy the best and the worst Batman games. My love of Batman really began right here, with 1990's Batman the video game for the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was done by Sunsoft, and top to bottom it is one of the finest examples of 8-bit development you'll find. Visually, it captures the dark and foreboding areas of Gotham City perfectly, and man does that soundtrack belt out audio that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. But as good as the presentation was, it was the gameplay that tied it all together. Batman has multiple weapons, can wall jump, and there are a bunch of boss encounters featuring guys not in the Tim Burton movie at all. And I think that's why this turned out so well. It originally began life as an independent Batman release not associated with the movie. During development, that changed, so it included content both relevant to the film and some stuff that had nothing to do with it at all. It made for a great mix of familiar comic book characters and action that didn't necessarily jive with the movie elements. One thing you will notice right off the bat is that this game is difficult. It has that old school mentality of punishing you until you recognize the best way forward. That challenge never ruins the fun factor, however, and this definitely deserves a place on this list. Sunsoft nailed just about every aspect of this product perfectly. When Acclaim got a hold of the Batman license in 1995, they thought it best to go the Mortal Kombat route. Using digitized assets across the board and gameplay that mimics a fighting game, this is one of the most unappealing software releases of the 16-bit generation. It's clunky, unresponsive, looks terrible, sounds awful, and the only people I've ever seen enjoy it were those poor kids that were stuck with it. Even now, all these years later, I can barely stomach it for more than 5 or 10 minutes before I want to hit the power button and bow out. The Genesis version is particularly bad thanks to the lower on-screen colors and disgusting soundtrack. Acclaim often had no shame in releasing bad games, and this was definitely one of their worst. As bad as it was, Acclaim was far from done in making poor Batman titles. Watch on to see more of these abominations. You knew this was gonna be here. In 1991, I played this for my Sega Genesis and it was love at first sight. It's much closer to the 1989 film than the NES version was, and it plays quite differently as well. Here, Batman is more grounded and relies on punches and kicks as his main weapons, with his projectiles being much more limited in number. Instead of wall jumps, you have a grappling hook that you can get around the stages. It's still platform heavy, of course, and Sunsoft even added some Batmobile driving stages, and you get to take to the skies in the Batwing. It's short, but the graphics and sound presentation is so powerful, you just don't care. I can't tell you how many times I've listened to this OST while mowing grass, cleaning, washing the car, or weed eating. It's even playing right now as I edit this video. From the moment Batman descends onto the Gotham City streets, it's a memorable experience every step of the way. It's not perfect, but for early 16-bit releases, it was far better than most licensed software at that time. I wanted to like 1992's Batman Returns for the Atari Lynx. In some ways, I think my inner 16-year-old self still tries to like it to this very day. But in the end, it's just not a very good game. The repetition of enemies never lets up, resulting in a 30-minute ride of punching bad guys in the nuts. The stage design is little more than walking right and never really adds any meaningful platforming or vertical movement beyond jumping over things. Despite having some nice colorful visuals, the sound here is particularly bad. I mean the kind of bad that you want to turn the volume way down. With just 4 stages, the developers made it a bit difficult, and I'm willing to bet most of you have never seen it past the first stage or 2. Thing is, it's not really good enough to keep you playing to see more. It had potential, but this needed a lot more time in the oven and some variety away from the non-stop enemies. The Lynx was starving for game titles during its life, but not even that can save this one. Play it for the experience, but I seriously doubt many of you will stay to the end. In 1993, the Super Nintendo got its own version of Batman Returns by Konami, and man did I dig this one. It takes a very Final Fight approach, being a beat-em-up instead of a straight action platformer the other systems ended up with. The soundtrack is spot on, and while the graphics aren't anything super impressive, they get the job done. I enjoyed this so much more than the Sega published effort on the Genesis, and really wish Konami had the license to port this instead. The only weakness it really had was the lack of a 2-player co-op mode, which was kinda weak if you were accustomed to such things thanks to Streets of Rage. Outside of that complaint, Konami had a winner here, and it's one of the better releases to carry the name of that film. The Super Nintendo and Genesis having their own versions of games was often a great thing back then, but this is one instance where I wish Konami was fully in charge and just ported this version everywhere. Or at least a version of this version. Kinda makes you wonder what Batman Returns would have looked like using the Streets of Rage 2 engine on the Genesis. With Konami providing the template for a Batman beat-em-up, you'd think all Acclaim had to do was copy it for 1996 Batman Forever the arcade game. Nope. Once again, they digitized the hell out of everything, and then made the gameplay so over-the-top ridiculous, it just grew tiresome minutes after you started. The enemy AI is so cheap, and death comes out of the blue so often, you have no clue where your life bar went. The graphics are just a sensory overload, with crappy effects blasting off constantly and bringing the flow of the action to a crawl. I honestly sit here completely at a loss to how you could mess up a Batman beat-em-up so badly. To make matters even more depressing, this originated on Sega's STV Titan arcade board, so the home version was pretty much identical, something that should have been awesome. It ultimately doesn't matter because there just isn't anything here worth your while. It's ugly, frustrating, and just plain a poor effort by a company known for such endeavors. The 2-player co-op does add some much needed motivation to keep playing, but that gameplay and cheap AI just keeps hammering the fun factor. It could have been at least average without all the issues, but in the end, this is yet another Acclaim disaster. When screens of Batman Arkham Asylum started showing up in 2009, I was blown away. It looked phenomenal and captured Batman's world perfectly. Thing is, most of the Batman titles that used 3D polygons in the years leading up to this weren't very good, so it had been a while since the franchise had given us something worth playing. But worth playing this definitely was. Trapped in the infamous Arkham Asylum, there were all sorts of crazies on the loose and doing bad things. You have the run-of-the-place Metroid style, and must find additional weapons and upgrades to deal with the situation. Batman also has a nasty hand-to-hand combo system that allows all sorts of cool takedowns, combos, and grapples. Whether you played from the shadows or went in batarangs blazing, you could play it any way you wanted. Memorable boss encounters, a great story, and perhaps the best level design of any game ever. And you had an experience you just couldn't miss. It spawned 2 additional sequels that used similar gameplay, and while they were very good themselves, I still liked this one the best. This was developer Rocksteady Studios' first outing with the Cape Crusader, and they hit a grand slam home run to be envied by all who touch the license in the future.
Better hurry! Things are heating up! 3, 2, 1. Great job, Dad! Power's all too low, bluey green. Question is, can you get him down before it comes back on?
The power won't stay off forever. Cut me down.
Being such a big fan of Batman on the Genesis, you can bet I was excited to play 1992's Batman Revenge of the Joker. Little did I know that Sunsoft had farmed this one out to a developer that had never done a game like this before. And it really shows in every facet of this release. The visuals are strange, the sound is a joke, and the gameplay is frustrating. You start getting hit from the moment you start moving, and it's the kind of stuff that's exhausting to defend against. Things falling on your head, blending in with the backgrounds, and moving far faster than you is the order of the day. Everything about it just fights you tooth and nail to keep you away from having any fun at all. You have a number of weapons, but they lack effectiveness in the oddest of ways. Some enemies just don't seem to be bothered by anything but your standard attack. You can eventually get good enough to enjoy it, but most will be turned away and not bothered due to the constant and unrelenting stage and enemy design. To see the Sunsoft name fall so heinously in just a year's time was really depressing, even more so since I enjoyed the NES release of this one far more. A port of that would have been far more preferable. In 1990, Sunsoft also released a Batman for the Game Boy, and it's the most un-Batman-like product on this list. You go about blasting enemies with a gun, getting power-ups like satellites, and blasting bricks like a run-and-gun Mario. You may be thinking this looks simple as hell and you'd be right, but that simplicity was much of its appeal. On the Game Boy, it had a perfect mix of action, platforming, and enemy interaction. It even had some cinematics thrown in for good measure. Like the Genesis version, Sunsoft added in some vehicle-based action to keep things fresh, though it's just a single stage. It's short, but I loved it at the time. There's not much to speak of as far as graphics go. I mean, just take a look. It's about as simple as a game gets. But for what it lacks in visual flair, it makes up for with its killer tunes. Sunsoft has the Game Boy really jamming here, and it puts most games to shame on far more powerful hardware. I have such fond memories of this, I still fire it up and play it every so often. It really was the perfect portable experience for that hardware. In 2000, Kimco and Ubisoft teamed up to release Batman Beyond: Return of the Joker for the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. It was based on the TV show and movie around the same time, which was set in the future and had an elderly Bruce Wayne mentoring a new Batman. I enjoyed the show and had high hopes the game here would do it justice. Nope, not at all. The new Batman controls like a mech. The simplistic combat feels clunky and slow. The AI is ridiculously inept and follows routines that make them all feel like robots. The repetition to it all is unreal. I mean, at the heart of the experience, it's essentially just a beat 'em up, but because it's so slow and moves so poorly, it lacks the basic fun that older games easily maintained. They had an interesting idea providing different kinds of suits that give you various abilities, but in the end, none of these things can help the gameplay much. It's a lumbering mess of mistakes that will have you wondering if Acclaim secretly made this one and sold it to Kimco for a quick buck. The source material should have made for a decent beat 'em up, but the execution here couldn't have been any less interesting. You'll know within 5 minutes that this atrocity has wasted enough of your time already. In 1991, Sunsoft released Batman: Return of the Joker for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This was the basis of the Genesis game Revenge of the Joker we went over just a bit ago, but it's done so much better here. The gameplay moves better, the enemies don't get lost in the backgrounds or constantly drop in out of nowhere, and when a design element is similar, it's still done better here, giving you a fair chance to deal with it. It's still challenging as hell, but it's in a way where playing it a few times makes you understand the patterns and how to respond. You aren't swamped with constant and exhausting damage like the Genesis version. In addition to that, it's also one of the very best looking NES adventures you'll find. The large sprites look great, the backgrounds are loaded with touches you typically don't see in 8-bit titles, such as multiple layers and vegetation blowing in the wind. There's a bit of sprite flicker to contend with, but it surprisingly holds up well and manages to look nearly as good as some early PC Engine and Genesis releases. When the Genesis remake was done, someone obviously got the bright idea to make it more difficult, and that just ended up backfiring completely. This is the best way to play this game, and a far superior version. Kimco got another shot at Batman in 2003, this time on the GameCube called Dark Tomorrow, and it makes Batman Beyond look like an absolute masterpiece in comparison. Hell, it makes almost every game on this list look like an unmissable gem. Again, we have a 3D beat 'em up here, with gameplay that has you running around punching and kicking enemies into submission. But these bad guys don't stay down unless you bat cuff them. This tedious mechanic lasts the entire game and makes the combat a chore to be despised. But it's the fixed camera angles and awful feeling of navigation that makes it unplayable. I spent the first 10 minutes falling off the rooftops just trying to make it to the next cutscene. I even got caught mid-swing a bunch of times and just floated there. The story has the League of Assassins attacking Gotham and using diversionary tactics with some of Batman's old foes to throw him off. But you won't find any of that interesting since the gameplay is just so poorly done. By 2003, you'd think a developer that had multiple tries could nail a somewhat fun 3D brawler with this license, but Kimco failed on all fronts. It was ported to the Xbox where it sucked to high heaven as well, so you'll want to stay away from them both if you value your sanity. In 2011, Rocksteady Studios was back with a direct sequel to Arkham Asylum called Arkham City. This took everything you loved about the first and set it in a much larger world. The story has both Arkham and Blackgate being closed down and a new prison being put inside Gotham itself. This new area allows prisoners to roam around freely, and there's all kinds of craziness to deal with as the fallout from Arkham Asylum is still front and center. Batman once again gets all kinds of cool ways to take down bad guys, from Metal Gear style stealth to just rolling in gangsta style and letting the carnage unfold. The open world go anywhere gameplay also makes for secrets to find, areas to explore that are loaded with fan service, and an overall sense of respect for the source material. Batman had some rough patches on its way to this series, but Rocksteady Studios did a fantastic job making sure the characters and story were just as interesting as the impressive graphical presentation. They succeeded on all fronts, and this is easily one of my favorite games with this license. The tighter, more intimate Arkham Asylum was the best, but this is a very close second and a must-play for fans of the Bat.
You're lucky we found you first. How do you think things would have gone down if Penguin got his hands up?
Batman, he's here. You were right. It's the Bat. Arkham City is going to burn. Arkham City is where you're gonna die. You're gonna die, Bat. Help me!
Acclaim was back in 1998 with Batman and Robin, which was based on the film of the same name and a PlayStation exclusive. This takes Batman into a fully 3D world and actually has quite the novel approach. The missions take place at certain times, and you need to be at the right place at that right time to engage the mission. Some simple detective work is in place to give the game a bit of depth, and the open world pretty much allows Batman to come and go as he pleases, which does include driving the Batmobile around Gotham. But this was Acclaim after all, and of course the gameplay is absolutely atrocious. There is no finesse to Batman's movement. He's stiff, animated poorly, and the camera does you no favors while exploring the tighter areas. The combat gameplay is ultra simplistic and repetitive, and never really amounts to more than just button mashing the various attacks to dispatch enemies, including the bosses. Batman has a few interesting toys to play with, but none of them feel like crucial parts of the gameplay to learn, and often come off as little more than tacked on novelties. It ends up being little more than searching for clues, bashing enemies, and defending against vehicles while driving around town. The visuals are terrible as well. I admire the attempt at a fully 3D world, but the models, animation, and constant polygon clipping really destroys the presentation. Add in the nearly unplayable control, and this very well may be the worst Batman game I've ever seen. Probe developed this, and while there is a skeleton of an innovative game here, it needed a lot more time to get it even remotely enjoyable.
You are not sending me to the cooler.
I didn't want to leave this episode on a negative note, particularly one as bad as Dark Tomorrow and Batman and Robin, so instead I've thrown together an honorable mention section for Batman games I'd recommend you give a try. First up is the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions of The Adventures of Batman and Robin. The Genesis version was developed by Clockwork Tortoise, and was a tough-as-nails run and gun with great visuals and awesome special effects. You'll need to devote some time to learn its gameplay, but it's a wild ride worth taking. The Super Nintendo version was done by Konami, and was a completely different game. It is much more a traditional action platformer beat-em-up with a heavier focus on Batman's gadgets and detective work. It has some cool visual effects of its own, and a soundtrack true to the show. I'd also like to take a moment and mention the 1993 Game Boy release, Batman the Animated Series. This was developed by Konami, and like Sunsoft's previous effort, they kept things simple and extremely easy to pick up and play. Batman has wall jumps and a grapple hook to get around, and it makes for a very good time. Combat is simple, consisting of melee attacks and batarangs for distant enemies. This may not seem like much, but for a game on the go, it was just right. In many ways, it's what the Genesis game may have evolved into had there been a direct sequel. I also love the music in it, which the Game Boy seemed to have an incredible knack for. If you love the more platformy titles on the NES and Genesis, this Batman right here might just be for you. As I said in the opening, there are a number of Batman games I've never played, especially when you factor in computer editions. There are also a bunch of Batman titles I'd label so-so or average, and they just didn't belong in either of my categories here. If you'd like to sound off in the comments about some of those games, I'd love to hear your opinions on what folks should try and what they should avoid. Overall, Batman had a very rocky road in terms of quality when it comes to video games. There have been some real worthy software that is very much worth playing, but there have also been some landmines of unbelievable garbage. And that's not even counting all the games that have Batman in them. There are vehicle-based titles, fighting games, and even some Telltale-based graphic adventures starring everyone's favorite vigilante. If you like Batman, there is certainly a game type out there for you no matter what you enjoy. I hope this list we just went over gives you a basic outline on where to start and what to avoid. Some of these are a blast to play and easy to emulate, while the more modern stuff tends to be quite affordable. If you have played all of these and are in the market for something new, be sure to keep an eye on Rocksteady Studios' new game coming in 2024 called Suicide Squad: Kill the Justice League, which is a continuation of the Arkham series. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.